I believe you started life endowed with something very useful for any politician, a very strong voice.
Well, in fact, my Aunt Olive reminded me of the fact after I was elected to Congress that my loud voice was something I'd had from the beginning. She said she vividly recalled when she used to visit us in Yorba Linda when I was a baby that my father would be out on the tractor in our lemon grove. And I would be crying, and I would cry so loud that he'd come in off the tractor raging at my mother and saying, "Hannah, if you can't keep that boy quiet, I'll have to get off this tractor and do it for you."
You had talked about reading the Los Angeles Times cover to cover, and particularly the sports pages. Were there any particular sports you followed, or did you have any particular heroes in those days?
Well, I followed practically all sports, and baseball and football and so forth and so on. Now, boxing is something I don't care for today. I've never seen a professional boxing match. But I was fascinated by the accounts of the Dempsey-Carpentier fight, where Carpentier, the Frenchman, was considered to be a war hero, and Dempsey, I think unfairly, as I learned later, was considered to be a slacker. Dempsey, of course, knocked out Carpentier, who basically wasn't heavy enough to fight Dempsey in the fourth round, although Carpentier staggered Dempsey in the third round, according at least to the report I read. I think the most exciting one that I read about, though, was the Dempsey-Firpo fight. I mean, they built that up. The hype was fantastic. Firpo, the wild bull of the Pampas, fighting Dempsey. And that was the fight where Firpo, after being knocked down a couple of times, knocked Dempsey down and even out of the ring. And after having been knocked out of the ring, I'm sorry, let's start that one over again. Was the fight that I remember even more vividly was the Dempsey-Firpo fight, because they built up Firpo with a terrific hype, the fact that he was the wild bull of the Pampas from Argentina. Incidentally, I met him many years later in 1958 in Argentina, and that Dempsey, of course, would be the giant killer. Well, it turned out that way, but it was a dramatic fight because Dempsey knocked Firpo down about 8 times, and Firpo knocked Dempsey down certainly at least 2 or 3 times, and in the second round Dempsey of course knocked him out, but it was one of the most dramatic fights of all. I don't know why, after having followed those fights, I didn't become a boxing fan, but some way it just never appealed to me.
Do you think in terms of the, how do you feel about the current controversy in after the death of the young Korean fighter in the Mancini fight, do you think boxing should be stopped?
Boxing turns me off, frankly. I would say that the only thing about boxing is that Howard Cosell is a great announcer for boxing. I frankly don't think that baseball and football are his bag. He wouldn't agree with that. But he is superb when it comes to boxing.
Why is that? What makes a good boxing announcer?
It's a combative feeling. Get you feeling that you're there. But somewhere it just seems to me that particularly today, the way the boxers beat each other senseless, the way they're managed. Well, I'll tell you one thing that turned me off on boxing particularly. I knew Joe Louis. He supported me in 1960. And this man, who perhaps was the greatest, maybe even greater than Dempsey or Muhammad Ali, this man was so mismanaged by his managers, ripped off, that he died owing several $1 million to the Department of Internal Revenue Service. And when I thought of that, what he had done for his race, what he had done for boxing and so forth, I thought, something wrong with this thing. It is not a sport. So my feeling today is that you're not going to outlaw boxing. You're not going to get away with it any more than you can outlaw drinking. But as far as I'm concerned, I outlaw it in my own mind. I don't ever intend to follow it. I don't ever watch it on TV.
Can we stop 1 second? I need to fix the mic cable. Please, audio assistant in.
We'll go to apple pie.
Frank, while we're on hold here for a second, how soon before you leave the nurse picture?
Oh. It's the first picture, not for several minutes, I'd say. Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can even say to me, let's go to that picture from yesterday because I'll edit that line out, but we'll know when to go to it, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Stand by, everybody. 5 seconds, back to studio. Dark on the line, hold it, quiet, studio. Here we go.
Talking about apple pies, you once said that your mother's apple pie reminded you of a movie of Waterloo Bridge.
Yes, I remember the movie because it was a very moving movie. Jimmy Stewart was in it, and I recall that he was trying to court a rather flashy showgirl type in New York and in London. And let me start again. I recall the movie because Jimmy Stewart was in it, and he was courting a rather flashy showgirl type. And in trying to get it across, he was, of course, sort of a country boy in the service and so forth. He told her that he felt about her the way he felt about his mother's apple pie. And then he said, my mother made wonderful apple pie. And when she died, I have never had apple pie again. And that's the way I feel about you.
You mentioned that Albert Upton, the professor at Whittier, was a very iconoclastic man.
Yes.
Created a
Well, at Whittier, he
impression.
certainly, of course, wouldn't have been an atheist, but I would say he was skeptical. He was the one that had me read Tolstoy, of course, and approved of the fact that I, of course, read Rousseau and a lot of other people in my French classes. On the other hand, Upton who was a professor of English, and a very good one, he had a very, very high regard for the Bible, not just for religion, but more as literature. He said it was some of the great literature of all time. And he said probably the greatest book ever written was the book of Ecclesiastes. And so when I was in the Pacific, we didn't have much to read, but the Bible that my grandmother had given me when I had graduated from college, I read virtually every day, to my great profit.
Even as a college student, you had the competitive instinct and spirit that has characterized you throughout your career. As president of the Pep Club, I read that you set a highly competitive goal for yourself.
I certainly did. You see, Whittier, of course, was a Quaker school, and it was not, of course, just a coincidence that our homecoming day was on Armistice Day every year. And one year we'd play Occidental, one great rival, another year we would play Pomona. This was a year that we were playing Pomona, and I was chairman of the PEP committee. And we always had a bonfire, and the chairman of the PEP committee had the responsibility of building the bonfire, and it was traditional to put on the top of the bonfire a privy. Those were the days when you had outside privies. Well, up to that time, they had had one-hole privies and two-hole privies, but never a three-holer. And so with a couple of my colleagues in the class on the PEP committee, we scoured the country. We found a marvelous three-hole privy, and we liberated it and took it and put it on top of the bonfire. It was the greatest bonfire we've ever had at Whittier.
Did you win the game?
We did that year. Yes, we did.
You also, in college, you played basketball, didn't you, as a...
Well, I think that's an exaggeration. I think I pointed out that I was really not very good at any of the sports. On the other hand, when I did play basketball in my freshman year, in a game against Laverne College, I was trying to guard a very good forward from Laverne. And I guarded him fairly closely, it was fairly, and he came down into the front of my mouth with his elbow like that and broke a tooth. Well, as a result of that, I had a terrible problem because I had to get the tooth, of course, fixed.
A visible tooth?
No, the tooth right in the front like this. And so consequently, my tooth experiences since there have been very interesting. One, for example, involved Pat. I remember when I met her that the tooth had been, of course, replaced and attached to another one with a gold band. And she didn't think that was attractive. She always had a thing about teeth. She believed in having teeth looking very good. And she insisted, after we were married, that we put some of our hard-earned money into getting a porcelain cap, one that didn't show the gold. And then years later, in 1972, on inauguration, on election night it was, I was sitting there listening to the returns and having a bite to eat, and the cap broke. And Dr. Chase had to come in, and down in the basement of the White House, he hurriedly put in a repair job, and millions of people that heard me accept the fact that we had won and make the victory speech didn't know that I'd had 2 hours in a dentist chair before going on.
Was there a danger that it might, even then, that it might fall off?
I was always worried about that. But Dr. Chase is one of the great dentists. Incidentally, he is a great story himself. He was from Russia, an immigrant from Russia. He had come over very, very young to the United States and worked his way up. He was Jewish. And when I went to Russia in 1972, that was a time that we were arguing with Brezhnev about Jewish immigration and the rest. I took him along as a member of our delegation. He proceeded to get himself invited, and I, of course, backed him up to the various clinics for dentistry in the United States. He told me afterwards, he said, well, these people may be very good at missiles, but they're not very good at dentistry. They're 50 years behind us with their iron teeth and everything.
Do you think that having brought a prominent Jewish dentist as part of your party and with discussions about Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union on the agenda, did Brezhnev understand that?
I think
the message you were sending?
I think the message got over, because I also brought with me on that trip Admiral Rickover, who of course is a Polish Jew. And he insisted, incidentally, on seeing the Polish nuclear submarine and made himself quite obnoxious, quite deliberately, and I think quite properly. But what it did, I think it convinced Brezhnev that to me it just wasn't a question of arguing because of the political situation in the United States. That wasn't it. But I introduced these people as men I admired, men who were my friends, men who meant a great deal to our country. And I said, under the circumstances, that it would be very helpful to our mutual relations in other areas, arms control, trade, etc., if he could relent his policy with regard to Jewish immigration. And he did, because in 1972 we had the highest number of Jews being let out of the Soviet Union up to that time, 37,000, as compared with only 600 the year I came into office in 1969.
And I think 72 was also the last high point. It's gone down since then.
It's gone down since then, because
what should we be doing differently to?
Well, what we should be doing is to recognize that all of our dealings with the Soviet Union should be put in one package. It should be not simply arms control emphasized at the exclusion of other things. You link them all, but it's very important not to link them publicly in a way that makes the Soviet Union back down in the public eye. It was a great mistake, for example, through the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was passed after we got 37,000 out in 1972, which conditioned publicly any further relations with the Soviet Union, or other countries for that matter, on their immigration policies. As a result, the Soviets said, you're not going to do that to us, and they cut back. Do it privately, but let it make it very clear that if they don't come across on that, it may inhibit progress in other areas that they're interested in. It works.
What do you think goes through Andropov's mind, or what is his reasoning when he sits in the Kremlin and considers the problem of Jewish dissidents in the Soviet Union today?
I think he will be very pragmatic about it. Pragmatic because, well, we have to understand first that there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, even though some of the earliest leaders of the Marxist Society were Jewish, and some of the earliest participants in the Soviet hierarchy were Jewish. But Stalin was certainly anti-Semitic. I remember, for example, Brezhnev telling me on one occasion, I thought it was rather interesting, in Summit 4 in 1974, as we were riding from Yalta in the Crimea back to the airport. And we were talking about the problem of Jewish immigration, and he was complaining about the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And he turned to me and grabbed my arm. He was very physical. He was always grabbing people like Lyndon Johnson did. Sort of reminded me of Lyndon. And he grabbed my arm and he said, "Let me tell you, Mr. President, as far as the Jews are concerned, let them all go out and let God go with them." I think he was more interested, incidentally, in getting God out of the Soviet Union than the Jews. Coming back to Andropov, I think Andropov, as far as Jewish immigration is concerned, will be reasonable on it, but he's going to use that somewhat as a card for things that he wants. And let me say that that's the way international politics is played. It shouldn't be that way. After all, as a matter of right and a matter of decency, he should let out the Jews, the Pentecostals, and others. But these people don't play that way. They do nothing unless they're going to get something in return.
Are the dissidents, and particularly the Jewish dissidents, are they doing the right things? Are they agitating in the right way?
I think calling attention to the discrimination against them is correct, yes.
And productive.
I think as far as legislation is concerned, where a president, for example, says, I insist that you engage in a policy which will allow more immigration. As far as that is concerned, where it's done as a government, that's one thing. Where it's done as individuals, that's something else again. The Soviet Union differentiates between a government acting and individuals. And where individuals, certainly people interested in Jewish immigration, should continue to speak out. But the government should play it in a quiet, effective way.
Do you think Raoul Wallenberg is still alive?
I have wondered about that. I think it's very possible. But
do you think we'll ever know?
Oh, no, no.
To go back somewhat in time, when you were in college and in law school, did you listen to the fireside chats? Did you listen to Franklin Roosevelt on the radio?
I don't recall listening in college. I do recall listening in law school. And incidentally, one thing that I have noted in recent years, when I was president, people said, "You ought to have fireside chats." And I said, "How often?" They said, "Well, he used to have them once a week." Then I recalled, I tried to think, I don't think they were that often. And so I checked recently. Roosevelt's fireside chats averaged 3 a year. One year he made 5, another year only 3 to 4. But they were great events. Becoming too familiar would have been a mistake, something I always recognized and something that he certainly recognized. They were very effective, as I recall. I don't remember particularly what he said, but I do remember they gave you kind of a lift. He had a buoyant characteristic in his voice, a sense of optimism, which was very important. Something which President Reagan has, too. It's that buoyancy, that optimism, which people needed to feel in the depths of the Depression.
How much?
As a matter of fact, though, when you would think that a group of law students at Duke University, if it were like today, you'd think we'd be talking politics all the time, but that wasn't the case. We were working so hard to get good grades so that we could get good jobs and we came out, that we didn't spend much time talking politics that I can recall. As a matter of fact, the broadcasts that I remember, far more than the fireside chats, was the time that the Duke of Windsor, Edward, gave his famous speech where he said that he was going to abdicate. And I remember we all sat and we heard it on radio, several of us, and Douglas Maggs, the professor of torts, who was tough and seemed to be one that had no sentiment at all afterwards, he just said, "Wasn't that a magnificent thing? Wasn't that a magnificent thing?" Incidentally, many years later, the Duke of Windsor and came to the White House as our guest for a dinner that we gave in 1971. I was glad we were able to do it.
Would you have given up the throne of England for the woman you loved?
Possibly, yes, but I think under the circumstances, it would have depended upon what the throne could do. I think the Duke of Windsor gave it up for reasons that many could understand. I mean, what is the King of England? Well, the King of England is a very important job. You have position, I should say. The subjects bow and scrape, and you have an unlimited budget, and you're respected all over the world, but no power. As far as I was concerned, I've always said that what separates the men from the boys in politics is that the boys want office. They want to be president in order to be somebody. The men are people that want office in order to do something. The King of England didn't have much to do. No, when I reflect on your question, my guess is that I would have probably taken the woman I love rather than staying on in what I consider to be particularly just a ceremonial job.
Does President Reagan instill in you the same optimism from his fireside chats about the state of the economy that Franklin Roosevelt did back then?
Well, I'm in a very different position now. Then I didn't know anything about government. Then I didn't know what would work or what wouldn't. And then we were all reaching out for anything, that would give us hope for reducing unemployment. Incidentally, let us understand, the New Deal didn't end the Depression. There were still 9 million unemployed at the time that in 1939, before we became involved in war production. And the war, of course, is what ended the Depression. But on the other hand, I would say that at that point, he at least gave hope. As far as President Reagan is concerned, yes, I think he does for most average people. As far as people that are politically sophisticated, they're going to make up their own minds as to whether interest rates are too high or too low, whether the Fed has the right policy or wrong, whether you ought to cut the budget or increase it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I admire President Reagan for his ability to communicate that sense of optimism, which he really feels. He's a fine actor, but I don't think he's acting when he says that he believes we've turned the corner.
Are you optimistic?
In the long run, yes. 84, yes. 83 will be a solid year, but not a great year, in my opinion, for the economy.
We know where you and some of your Duke colleagues were now by the radio in 1936. Where were you at the time of some other great events? Where were you when you heard about the outbreak of the Second World War?
Well, I remember that very vividly. That morning, Pat and I were going to the movies in Los Angeles, and we stopped by to see her sister, Neva Renter, and Mark. And Mark, who was sort of a radio bug, was listening to the radio, and he said, "I just heard this report in the radio that the Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor." And there have been so many war scares and that sort of thing that we paid very little attention to it. Hadn't been corroborated as far as we knew. We went on to the movies. We were in the movies, and I can't remember the movie, but I remember some fellow came out and interrupted the movie, and he said all servicemen should report to their units. Well, we stayed in the movie. I was not in the service at that point. When we left, I remember a newsboy came on. There was an 8-column head in the special edition of the Los Angeles Times. And I said, "What is this?" He said, "We're at war, man. We're at war."
Where were you on VJ Day?
Oh, New York
At the
City.
end of the war.
New York City. And I remember that, not just because it ended the war and we could look forward to peacetime pursuits, but because of a personal disaster that occurred. Pat and I decided to go down to Times Square, and there were huge swarming crowds and all that. And when we finished and started to go home to our apartment on West 93rd Street, I reached into my back pocket, and my billfold had been taken. A pickpocket had rubbed against me, and apparently they got a lot of them. And incidentally, that was the second time, and you should never have a second time on things of that sort. If it happens once, you don't let it happen again. But at Duke University, several years before that, at least 10 years before, I'd attended the North Carolina-Duke football game. Carolina was the favorite. Duke won 25-0, incidentally. I remember the game like it was yesterday. I remember Julie Ward, not a great halfback, but a pretty good one, who on Duke's first touchdown ran over the left side on the reverse for 40 yards to the first touchdown. But the thing about the game that I particularly remember was that it was very cold, a little misty snow and rain falling, and it was a very boisterous crowd because they were drinking in that period, the Duke being a dry state, they were drinking Carolina corn whiskey, and it is really dynamite. It is about as dynamite as much as the Mao Tai that I had many years later in China. And so people were rubbing against each other and banging and the rest. And sure enough, as I went back to my room at Whippoorwill Manor, somebody had picked my pocket. I didn't dream I'd let it happen again, but it did VJ Day. But that's the only 2 times. Since then, I just don't carry money.
How did you handle in the vice presidential and presidential, the public years, the heavy ceremonial drinking requirements, particularly in China, where the custom at the banquets is to go around the tables and drink a toast of Mao Tai to every person?
Oh, yes. Well, I did exactly what my host did, and the same, Joe and Lai. We took a glass of that Mao Tai, they call it a cup, and you take it around and tip 15 times and just sip it, practically just smell it. When we finished, each of us had just a half a glass left. I did the same thing with Khrushchev when I saw him for a 6-hour luncheon in Moscow in the Dasha in 1959. Generally speaking, I would advise to people in this area to follow at least my example insofar as campaigning is concerned. During campaigns, I ruled out any drinking whatever for anybody, except if it was a weekend or something. And that included our press people and the rest. The only exception I made was for the press secretary. Most of the reporters drank, and I feel he'd have to drink, or they'd thought he was a jerk. But in any event, I have found that in order to be very sharp, you should not drink at all. And of course, in a campaign, the schedule starts very early in the morning, goes all day, and a drink will give you a lift at the end of the day. You think you're much better, but then the next day you have a hangover. You can't afford hangovers in a campaign. That's the general rule I would follow. And as far as diplomatic things are concerned, for example, the state dinners that we had, the various trips that we had abroad, whenever I had any discussion scheduled, I drank only to the extent the protocol required it. If it was champagne, sip it. I didn't like champagne anyway, so that made that easy.
Why not?
Well, we had a very, very tough experience with champagne in 1953. Tough, I say, because we were gone on a trip for 70 days around the world. And for 70 days, except for 1 day off in Melbourne, I remember it was a very rainy, cold day, so we didn't enjoy that too much. We had lunch and dinner with champagne. We liked it before the trip. Neither of us has liked it since. And although I serve it, of course, to people who come when they expect it, I have never had a glass of champagne since that time.
For going back to important days, for people of my generation, sort of a most common denominator that everybody remembers where they were was the death of President Kennedy. For people of your generation, I think the similar event was the death of FDR. Do you remember where you were?
Well, of course, I remember the Kennedy death too, but the FDR death I remember very vividly. We were in Philadelphia. I was settling contracts then at the end of the war with the Bud Manufacturing Company, whose office is in Philadelphia. And Pat and I were kind of splurging that night. We went to Bookbinders, that marvelous restaurant, which is still there, and I've been back since several times. They're good friends. And we were sitting having some of their famous lobster. And a very distinguished black waiter, our waiter, came up to us, and he was crying, just practically sobbing. And he said to me, "Have you heard the news? President Roosevelt has just died." That's how we heard it.
Where did you hear about the German invasion of Russia?
Another big event. I remember that particularly well because it was the day after our first wedding anniversary. We had saved our money and took a cruise on the last banana boat cruise, the Ulua that United Fruit had, which took us down to Central America. We were in Panama, we were in Cuba, etc. And on the 22nd of June, we were sitting in the dining room having something to eat, and our waiter, a very distinguished, intelligent black man, was there, and we asked him, because it came over the radio, the ship's radio, that Hitler's troops had invaded Russia. And so I asked him, I said, how do you think it's going to come out? Oh, he said, Hitler's made a great mistake. The Russians will win. You remember what happened to Napoleon. The same thing will happen to Hitler. He was a smart man, very perceptive.
Excuse me one sec. Let's take a 30-second stop. Keep the tapes rolling.
I'll ask you if whether Franklin Roosevelt was a master of the media or whether he had a friendly press. Whether Franklin Roosevelt was a master of the media or whether he had a friendly press. And you might mention that you didn't know until Yalta that he was crippled.
Oh, yeah.
And then,
Yeah,
oh good, this is the tragedy of history.
that's right.
Hello? Yeah. Oh, that's coming. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, but about three. Three episodes. Three, yes. Yeah, 5 minutes maybe. Okay. Okay. That's the nurse picture.
Later to study it.
Sure.
I don't know where that came from. It was not in my papers. You got it from San Clemente?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's the girl, though. I remember her very well. She was from Texas.
Was President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, a master of the media, or did he have a friendly press, or was it a combination of the two?
Well, I have studied that considerably, particularly in recent years. There's no question that Franklin Roosevelt was one of the media favorites. They liked him. They liked him even better than they liked Herbert Hoover, who was incidentally a master of the media, until he became president, when he didn't do as well. He did a fantastic job in building up a very good media image when he was engaged in running the programs for Belgian war relief, for Russian war relief, and also Secretary of Commerce. But Franklin Roosevelt just had something that the media liked. And I think, frankly, the fact he was liberal. Let's face it, the great majority of people in the media, just honestly, are just honest, sincere liberals. And they like a liberal. And also, Franklin Roosevelt was considered to be an activist. He was newsworthy. So consequently, I do think he had a very, very favorable ground to plow when he went out in his little press conferences and the rest. They liked him to begin with, and they wanted him to appear in the most favorable light. I think perhaps an indication of that is that I didn't become conscious of the fact that he was crippled until after World War II. I heard his voice in the radio. I never recall seeing a picture in the paper of him in a wheelchair or with the crutches and the rest. And I must say that in that score, I think the media was very responsible. It was the right thing to do. They wanted him to be considered just what he was. And incidentally, it's to Herbert Hoover and his supporters great credit that they never made anything out of the fact that here was a man who was crippled.
When you were in college, I think, your uncle Lyle came to visit from Ohio, your father's brother.
Yes, Uncle Lyle was my father's youngest brother, and my father felt very close to him and almost indebted to him because after his mother died, when he was about 8 years old, he was shunted around from family to family, and he said Uncle Lyle treated me the best when he stayed with him and his farm. He came to California. My father, as a matter of fact, sent him the ticket so that he could come on the train. And when he got there, he was so excited to see the mountains, because he had never seen mountains before, not big ones in Ohio, and also to see the ocean. And so we drove him down to the ocean to Seal Beach one day. And he was very anxious to put his toes in the water, so to speak. You know, he didn't know anything about swimming, but he wanted to get in the ocean. So we went to one of those places where you rent suits, as I recall, bathing suits. The only thing they had for him, he wasn't a very big man, was one of those real old-fashioned ones, you know, where the trunks come clear down to the knee, and he put those on, and it was really a very sort of a queer-looking get-up that he had. And I remember that my brother and I, Don, we were really a little ashamed when he put these on and went out and got into the ocean and jumped up and down on the waves and so forth. But in retrospect, I regret that we felt that way, and because it meant so much to him that we should have not worried about what all those strangers, and there were many of them on the beach at that time, they were looking at him and kind of laughing and so forth. We should have thought of him and not of what other people thought.
In law school, you couldn't have lived on Milky Ways. Man cannot live on Milky Ways alone. Where did you cook at Whippoorwill Manor, or did you eat?
No cooking. What we did was to eat in the union. They had an excellent student union, and you could buy a meal ticket where the meals, lunch and dinner, and we always had lunch and dinner, were 30 cents each. Well, that seemed to be pretty good, but that didn't satisfy Lyman Brownfield, who was one of my roommates at Whippoorwill Manor. He had a great big old Packard, I think it was a Packard, 7-passenger that he had bought at some auction or something, and he drove it around down there. And he found what is called a boarding house down in Durham, where you could get meals for 25 cents each. And so there were 6 of us joined him, making a total of 7. We got in that big old Packard, which he christened Corpus Juris, and we get it in Corpus Juris, and every noon we go down to the boarding house. We only paid 25 cents each, and he got his meal free. I don't think he could have made out on it, because the gas must have cost him that much, even though gas was only 16 cents a gallon then. But we had great fun in Corpus Juris, far more than we did reading it.
Did one of your other roommates, Albrink, who I don't know,
Freddie Albrink, yeah.
either as a practical joke or because he simply at the time couldn't resist something that was free, went to the clinic and signed you all up for something free there?
Oh, yeah. Well, Freddie Albrink, incidentally, who was a very good lawyer and retired as an admiral in the Navy in the Judge Advocate General's office. Also one who had a marvelous understanding of architecture. He used to give us lectures about the architecture of the beautiful Gothic Duke Chapel and compare it with what none of us had yet seen in Europe. But Freddie had a little wit too, and he said he'd just learned, he came in very excited, he said, you know, you can get free Wassermann tests over at the hospital. Well, we were thinking about doing it. Anything free in those days was something we could think of, until we found out that the Wassermann test was a test for pregnancy. And so we decided that Albrink had had his say, and we did him in another time.
Have you ever played a practical joke on anyone?
Oh, we have, yes. Oh, I remember, for example, the gridiron speech that I made in 1953. This was an effect similar to a practical joke. That was after I had made what was called the checkers speech in the fun controversy. And so the gridiron had a very rough skit on me about checkers, and I knew that it was going to be rough, and I had learned it in advance thanks to them. Fletcher Knable came on set. he was dressed as a dog and he cried and so forth and so on. And so what I did was to get the real checkers, our checkers, and I arranged to have that dog brought to the backstage in the Statler where the gridiron was held. And when I made my speech, I started out in a way that really scared my supporters to death. I remember Jack Knight, who was a great supporter of mine at that point, was just sitting there saying, he mustn't do it, because I started out and I said in a very serious way, I know that everybody is supposed to take whatever barbs are thrown at the gridiron dinner in good form and so forth and so on, and not respond. But this is one time you've gone too far. Fun is fun, particularly when that is directed against a lady. And now I want you to see the real checkers. And then Knebel came out holding checkers. Checkers, of course, was a female. Well, it brought the house down. And my supporters thought, well, he's not as serious as we thought.
Are you as serious as they thought?
Well, I would say that when you have something serious, I don't believe it does any good to smile about it. I think that it's very important not to get yourself so involved that you think you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. I think you've got to kid yourself, and I often do that. Most of my humor is situational. It has to do with kidding myself. But I would say that I am serious, very serious when it comes to important matters. But also, we have our fun.
You don't use political humor much in your speaking.
Never have told a story in a speech.
Is that for a reason?
Lynn Schuller, many years ago in high school, he said, that reminds me of a story. You don't do that. And I start a speech often. You got to shake hands with the audience. And so you start with a situational remark about something funny that has happened as you came in, or something that happened at a stop before that. But as far as saying, starting with a story like some of the great orators like Everett Dirksen, he was a marvelous storyteller. No way. And I know that is something you don't, something that you get a different viewpoint in the political science classes. They got books, joke books. You're supposed to tell canned jokes. You're supposed to tell canned anecdotes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I was very fortunate, may I say, in a way. At Whittier, we had some very good professors. We had good courses in history and English and philosophy and literature, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we had no political science courses. I have no regrets, and I don't advise young people going into politics to take political science. Study the classics when your mind is young, when you're going to pick up things, when it can expand and so forth, when you're developing the habits of a lifetime. Study that rather than getting into how do you work a precinct or how you poll and all that sort of thing. That can all come later.
When you went to Duke, it was your first time in the East, coming from the very tolerant, intellectually and racially community of Whittier. It must have been quite a culture shock to suddenly go into the South of the 30s. What was your experience, or what were your observations of that?
Well, it was a culture shock at beginning, but we had some pretty good goes with our Southern friends. About half the class was from the North or West, and half the class was from the South, and they were all smart, primarily because there were so many scholarships in the class. But I remember very early on, Bill Perdue, who was first in our class and brilliant, and a great student of history, set the climate for the rest of us for the 3 years. We were discussing the Civil War, or as they call it, the war between the states in the South. And we were remarking about who were the great generals, and I just assumed from my history, of course, although it was fairly objective, that Ulysses S. Grant, who later became president, was the greatest general of the Civil War. And Perdue then proceeded to read it to us about Robert E. Lee being not only the greatest general, but one of the greatest of all Americans. Stonewall Jackson, Albert Johnson, the rest. By the time he got through, we began to appreciate and respect the great Southerners.
Didn't Churchill later, when you were vice president, didn't he say,
In fact,
share
yes.
that view of Lee?
Yeah, I remember Churchill in 1954. Churchill, at a stag dinner at the British Embassy, was talking afterwards, and everybody was listening because he was, even he'd had a stroke by that time, he's still a commanding presence and marvelous command of language and so forth, and conveyed a sense of history that nobody else could. And he talked about Robert E. Lee, and he said, you know, Lee was without question the greatest general on either side in the Civil War. And he said he was also perhaps one of the greatest generals of all time. He didn't take anything away from Grant, however, because he then referred to Appomattox. And he said that one of the great moments was when Lee asked Grant if the officers could take their horses. And Grant replied, yes, the officers and the enlisted men may take their horses. This was after the surrender, because they will need them to plow their fields. And then Churchill sort of reared back in his chair, and he said, in the squalor of life and war, what a magnificent act.
We have a photograph from the South Pacific taken, do you recognize it? I think taken on Green Island.
I recognize it, yes, and I think I know the time that occurred. Not because of the officers who were there, because Augie Kuntz, the commanding officer of SCAT, who had come up the line from Noumea for an inspection trip, this is on Green Island, is there, and Harry Van Loo, who is the second from the right, a legendary United Airlines pilot before and after the war, is the next one. The one over there, beyond that, I don't know. Now, the one on my right is a nurse, and that's why I know when this was taken, because just the night before this picture was taken, I am sure that was when Charles Lindbergh arrived at Green Island. And when he arrived at Green Island, it was a big event for all of us, but nothing compared to the event when the nurse arrived the next day. And I confirmed that when I recently read in his wartime diaries his description of his visit to Green Island, his going to dinner there, and his description of the fact that the next day everybody in the island was excited beyond belief because the first nurse was arriving, and that there were literally thousands, not hundreds. The 3rd New Zealand Division was all gathered around, and the rest ogling this nurse that was come off. Now this nurse, as you can see, is very attractive. But I'm telling you, if that nurse who came off that day had been a female chimpanzee, they would have still whistled and oohed and awed because they hadn't seen any girls for a long, long time.
Do you think that the future of Lieutenant Nixon is indicated by the fact that of the thousands of soldiers and sailors on that island, that you were the one standing right next to her?
Well, I was standing next to her because, you see, she was attached to SCAT, too. And I was the officer in charge of the detachment. And in fact, I had arranged for the building of nurses' quarters, which they didn't have at any of the other stops along the line. So the nurses felt that I was one of their friends, too. Incidentally, that reminds me, too, of the fact that one of my greatest regrets of my service was the night before, after Lindbergh had arrived, that General Barraclough, who was the commander of the New Zealand Division, very graciously invited me to have dinner at his quarters with 7 or 8 others with Lindbergh. I declined because I was the host for our poker game that night, and I regret it ever since. And I was so glad that years later I was able to have Charles Lindbergh to the White House.
How did a good Quaker boy from Whittier become a poker shark in the South Pacific?
I had good teachers. You didn't have much else to do. Jimmy Stewart taught me well. Jimmy Stewart,
Not
who
the
was my
actor.
roommate. What?
Jimmy Stewart, the actor?
Oh, no, this is Jimmy Stewart. We always call him the other Jimmy Stewart. He's a very sophisticated New Yorker, still living in New York. He was my age. One of his great friends was Sherman Billingsley at the Stork
owner of
Club.
the Stork Club. Yeah.
And Sherman Billingsley, incidentally, was particularly good to him because he smoked cigars. Jimmy did, and he started me smoking cigars. Used to send him half a dozen boxes of Raymond Alona's Cuban cigars, which he shared with the rest of us on occasion. And so Jimmy gave me a lot of instruction, and of course you just learn by playing with others.
Do you remember your first cigar? Because you had not smoked at all to that point, had you?
Never. I never smoked a cigarette in my life. On occasion a pipe, but I don't do that. But I think that was the first time I ever smoked a cigar. No, it may have been before on some occasion. I don't recall, but I remember the first time I ever smoked when I got sick. But I learned later how to avoid that. Now I, of course, smoke them only occasionally, and never during the daytime, never publicly.
And never Cuban.
Unfortunately, no, not. They are still the best. I think, though, that some of the things I learned from poker are quite interesting.
What was your strategy?
Many people, for example, say, how is poker like politics? And of course, the Russians play chess, Americans play poker. I don't know anything about chess, and I'm sure, however, that they know a lot about poker. But generally speaking, the rules for poker apply pretty well in politics. The first thing I learned was don't get in too many pots. If the odds are great against you in a small pot, get out. Because otherwise, you will lose in small pots what you might want to use when the stakes are much higher in a much bigger pot. But while you should be cautious in the small ones, be bold in the big ones, be willing to risk all to gain all. Don't let somebody bluff you out. Another thing I learned a lot about bluffing. I found that those who talked the loudest usually didn't have the cards. The most effective way to bluff is to be very enigmatic. Another thing has to do with credibility. In order to win at poker, you must establish your credibility. Credibility that when you are betting, you've got the cards. And the way to do that, and this is very important in foreign policy too, is to establish your credibility up and down the line, a seamless web, and particularly on small pots. Make it very clear very early on through a small pot that whenever you're called, you do have the cards. And then when a bigger pot comes along, you may be able to bluff, and they may not call you because you've established your credibility later on. And that's one of the reasons that I was quite successful at poker. I must say, though, that my greatest experience, and I can remember the cards to these days, is a game of 5-card stud. The deal was made, 6 of us in the game, and I was dealt the ace of diamonds in the hole, the card that was down. And then in order, there were no wild cards in the game. In order, I got the king of diamonds, the queen of diamonds, the jack of diamonds, the 10 of diamonds. 2 of the other players had a pair showing by the time we'd gotten through the 4th card, and that's very good in a 5-card stud game. So they kept betting. I did not raise, while I couldn't be sure. On the other hand, it would have been a pretty good hand to bluff on because they thought I might have doubled up the king or doubled up the queen or what have you. But so when finally I got the 10, I didn't make any gesture whatever to show my excitement. And I was just thinking, my gosh, this couldn't happen. I understand it's a 650,000 to 1 shot. And so the first fellow that with the first pair bet, and of course he bet the $5. The game was what we call a 5 and 10 game. You open with $5, you can raise $5, the third bet is 10, and that's all. So he bet 5, the next fellow raised him, and so that made it $10. It finally came around to me. So what I did is that I bet the $10, the maximum. Unfortunately, I had established my credibility too well on the small pots. Nobody called me. So I raked in the chips, pretty good pot. And then, although you should never let people see your card unless they call you, they got to pay their money to see the card, I flipped over the ace. And everybody yelled. They never saw anything before that, and they'll never see anything like it again, probably.
What was the most critical small pot of the Nixon presidency?
It's difficult to sort anything out in that respect. I would say none of them are that small, actually. But I was putting it in another, perhaps another context. I think when the Russians, for example, supported the North Vietnamese, 3 weeks before we were scheduled to meet them at a summit in 1972 with tanks and guns and so forth, and the North Vietnamese launched a huge offensive across the DMZ into the South Vietnam. There were many of my advisors who said, do nothing about this because it will imperil the summit. And I said, well, if we don't do something about this, then I'll be going to the Soviet Union and be negotiating with Brezhnev with North Vietnamese tanks rumbling through the streets of Saigon. That won't go. So I called him, in effect, on that. We bombed and mined Hanoi and Haiphong. People thought that it would destroy the summit. Actually, it made him even more anxious. He knew that if we stopped them there, that we were worth dealing with, I think.
On a, if you were to set up a 10-point poker strategy scale, how would you rate in terms of what you would guess their style would be? How would you rate Harry Truman?
Oh, very well. Very well. Harry Truman was tough, resourceful. Even though he was not a foreign policy expert, he was not afraid to go to somebody smarter than he was in foreign policy, like Atchison and Marshall. And he knew how to play his cards, I thought, very well.
Eisenhower?
Better. I think the mistake, for example, that Truman made, and Atchison made too, and I think perhaps I have been much too harsh on Atchison in other respects, but not in this respect, was in terms of Korea. When Atchison made the statement that Korea was outside our defense line, that really gave the North Koreans a license, they thought, to invade the South. Better to have called them earlier to make it clear that we weren't going to concede that. We might have avoided the North Korean offensive. But Eisenhower was a very tough, shrewd poker player in international affairs.
If, as a lieutenant on Green Island or on Vela Lavella, you had in fact met Lieutenant John Kennedy, what kind of a poker player would he have been?
He would have been good. He would have been good. He was bold. He was very intelligent. It would have been a good match, as he proved in the campaign we had against each other in 1960.
Johnson? You see where I'm
Johnson,
going.
Johnson would have been, frankly, Johnson would have been much better had he been Johnson. I hear these days, for example, some of the enthusiastic, sincere, ultra-conservative supporters of Reagan say, let Reagan be Reagan. Well, the best advice Johnson could have had, let Johnson be Johnson, rather than trying to pander to his liberal critics. If Johnson had been Johnson, he would not have had gradual escalation of the war in Vietnam. I think he would have done something far more dramatic and decisive, as Johnson was not a weak man. And in that case, his weakness, I think, led to his downfall.
Gerald Ford?
Well, I won't get into any people that are living today. I think that would be improper.
And you may, in fact, end up playing poker with them and wouldn't want to tip your...
I'll tell you one, however, that I can name, because I have played poker with him, is Tip O'Neill. After I went to Congress in 1947, Carl Munt, who was on the Committee on Un-American Activities with me, was part of a poker game, a group. Tip O'Neill was in it, Ben Jensen of Iowa, and so forth. And they used to meet about every 2 or 3 weeks, maybe every month for poker. And O'Neill was a very, very tough, good poker player. He won far more often than I did. Now, I must say that I have an excuse there. They didn't play straight poker. In our South Pacific game, it was 5-card draw or 5-card stud, dealer's choice, but no wild cards. And this game that we played with O'Neill and Munt and so forth, 7-card, high, low, spit in the ocean, all that sort of thing. You might have 4 aces and somebody else would have 5 kings. You didn't know what the odds were. I was not any good at playing a game where I was unable to analyze the odds. But O'Neill was good at it.
Do you remember your first impressions of New York City?
Very vividly. I remember, incidentally, one thing that'll surprise people, the subways particularly. Exciting to get on the subway, how fast they were and how clean they were. They were clean and fast. I remember the streets, how clean they were. I remember that every morning I used to look out and here would come along a big conveyor with water on it in which they'd wash down the streets. I don't know whether it's done today or not. I don't really think they can afford it. It's still done in Paris, incidentally. The streets in Paris are very, very clean. But then I remember, too, particularly going to the plays and going to the opera. We saw Tobacco Road, and I must say I didn't realize that you could have that kind of profanity and that kind of rather obvious sexual-related things and get away with it. But in New York, you could get away with anything now, even more so than then. And I remembered going to the opera. I, of course, like music. And we went to the opera. We could only afford the least expensive seats. We sat in the great old opera house, which incidentally is infinitely more beautiful than the new one. I've never been to the new one because it is so sterile and hospital-like and the rest. It's like the difference between the Bolshoi Theater, which even Kosygin said was so much nicer with all of its 18th, 19th century grace than the new sterile one that they've got in the Kremlin, which they never took me to, incidentally. The Russians are more proud of the old one. But anyway, went to the opera, and we went to this 5th balcony we sat in. We could hear all right and so forth, but the seats, I recall, were very, very small and right up against you. And I remember sitting there with the seat in front of me, the fellow, a big fat fellow, leaning against it and bumping my knees all the time. But I still enjoyed the opera.
When you moved back to Whittier as a young lawyer, what did you do for transportation?
Well, before I get into that, I got to tell you one experience that we had in New York. We got ripped off. We were country boys, and apparently it showed, because one day we were getting into our car, and a panel truck, unmarked, pulled up right beside us, and a guy came up very breathless with us, and he had a big cardboard package in him. And he came up to me and said, listen, I'm a delivery man for one of the big stores that he named. I don't know, there was Saks or something like that. And he said, just a wonderful, something has happened, is that they double ordered on one thing, and I have an extra fur here, which I don't have to account for. And he said, would you like to buy it? He said, I'll sell it to you for $100. And we said, we don't have $100. Then he began coming down, $75, $60, so forth. At that time, 2 of us were standing by the car, and one of the other fellows had gone in to buy something at a drugstore. And he came walking up, and this guy began to shake, and he said, who's that fellow? Who's that fellow? He was scared. I didn't still get the message. Bill Perdue did, however, because he was a pretty cynical fellow. And Bill said, I don't think I'd get this. But the guy finally came down to $15, and we took it. It was a big fox fur piece with artificially colored black. And it wasn't any good. We took it home, gave it to my mother, and she, being the good sport that she was, wore it a few times, but she never threw it away. I remember even after she died, it was still in her closet, just as we had bought it that many years ago. Another thing I remembered in New York was the automat. My, they were good. You could get baked beans there for 10 cents. They were terrific. People could live in New York very well in that period with very little. At least that was the feeling. New York, of course, it was a very cold city in many ways. People didn't, they pushed and shoved and wherever you were and so forth and so on. But while it was cold and relentless, it also had a sort of a magnetic attraction, at least to me. And I wanted to come back. I wasn't sure when, but I thought someday I would like to come back and even live there.
When you went back to Whittier, what you had to get a car or you had to get around? What did you do?
Well, at that time, my old friend Clint Harris, who was on the football team at Whittier, had the Oldsmobile dealership in Whittier. So we bought an Olds. And in those days, in order to save money, you'd go back to the plant, Lansing, Michigan in this case, pick up the car and drive it across, because you could make, with gasoline being as cheap as it was, you could save money by buying it at the plant, rather than paying the railroad fare that it would take to ship the car by rail to California. So I took my younger brother Eddie back there, and we picked up the car and brought it back.
You told me once about that when you were courting Mrs. Nixon, you went, your loyalties were sorely tested because you took her to the USC Duke game. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that?
Oh, I do remember it very well. She had been a graduate of USC, and both of her brothers had played football, and so she understood the game, and she liked it almost as much as I did. Not quite, but almost. I, of course, has been a football nut all my life. I think anybody who doesn't play a game well probably likes it the better for that reason. So we went to the Rose Bowl. I remember we took a picnic lunch and ate it in the parking lot before going in. And we had good seats because I was a member of the Duke Alumni Association and so forth. It was a great game. Duke came into the game undefeated, untied, and unscored upon. And Duke had a 3-point lead going into the last 3 minutes of the game. And in those last 3 minutes, Howard Jones, the USC coach, a great coach, Wallace Wade was the coach at Duke, had a third-string quarterback by the name of Doyle Nave. And he came in and threw 4 straight passes to Al Kruger. His name was Antelope Al Kruger because he came from the Antelope Valley, and he ran like an antelope too. And he completed all 4 passes, and they scored and kicked the extra point. And so Southern Cal spoiled the perfect record, won the game 7-3. But I think perhaps because she was sorry for him may have been one of the reasons that tipped the scales in my favor when she decided to say yes.
Didn't you, on your way back to Washington, when you took the job at OPA, didn't you stop in South Bend and go to a Notre Dame game?
We, as a matter of fact, we stopped at South Bend. I think that was the year. No, yes, we stopped at South Bend. Let me think if I got that date correct, if that was the time. Yeah, we stopped at South Bend. We went to the USC Notre Dame game. USC lost the game. That's the first time I've ever seen a game at South Bend. And let me tell you, I've seen football crowds. I've seen them at Whittier. I've seen them at Duke. I've seen them at Southern Cal. I've seen the great professional games. You have never seen a crowd until you go to South Bend. They are really something.
Have you ever had in a secret fantasy life, the desire to be a sports commentator?
Oh, by all means, yes. I have made that
it's not
very
very
clear.
secret fantasy.
Yeah, I would enjoy being a sports writer, to travel, but not just to write about it, but to travel with the team, you know, and sit in the locker rooms with them and on the airplane and talk to them and find out about them and try to give them a little lift here and there and so forth, or even a sports announcer, you know, if I had the second life. As a matter of fact, one of the most tempting things, offers I ever turned down, it wasn't an offer, but it might have become that, was when Del Webb, who was the owner and general manager, in effect, of the New York Yankees, after I lost the presidency in 1961, came out to see me in California and asked me if I would allow him to put my name in for the commissioner of baseball. I, of course, was complimented. He knew I was a great baseball fan because I used to go all the time, and every time I could in Washington, both as congressman, senator, and vice president. And boy, I had thought a long time before turning that down. That must show that I still had politics in mind, even in 1961.
If you were a sports commentator, how would you have summarized this Super Bowl last?
Well, it was an excellent game. Of course, Reagan's justifiably gets the major credit because of his fantastic record-breaking 168 yards on the ground against the best defensive team in the NFL. But the real heroes of that game were the Hogs, that offensive line. The greatest back in the world can't run unless the offensive line pushes the other people back and opens the holes. I have often said, when presenting an award once to an offensive lineman, I said, I want to tell you something about you fellows. He said, offensive linemen are the most underpaid, unpublicized players in football. And they laughed, and they said, that's certainly true. I think, however, now, a lot of these people, these hotshot owners and so forth, that are out reaching for the superstars, the great runners and passers and so forth, after seeing what the Redskins did with Reagan's and also protecting Seisman when he had to make pass, that offensive linemen are going to be paid what they ought to be paid, and that is right at the top of the lineman scale.
Do you remember your first plane ride?
Yes, that was in Ottumwa. I was 28 at the time.
When you were in the Navy.
That's right. And I was 28 at the time. Jimmy James, I was the aide of the executive officer. He was the executive officer, and one day he was going out to flying from Ottumwa to Des Moines or some other place to pick up some equipment for our new base. We were just building our base there. And he said, have you ever taken a plane ride? And I said, no. He said, well, you should. And he says, come on, come along. It was a two-seater plane. He piloted, I sat in the second seat. I remember I had a heck of a time putting on the safety belt, the straps and so forth and so on, which you had to wear a harness. But I got it on and I got in. And I remember what a thrill it was to the plane to rise up there and then float out over the cornfields.
Did you ever imagine that you would become the most air-traveled figure in the world
Around the
history?
world more times than I even choose to remember. And let me say, incidentally, air sickness, just like seasickness and car sickness, was a problem for me, not on that trip, but on other occasions. But I got over it, which reminds me, of course, of what Churchill said to me about that. I remember Churchill in 1954, we were talking about vacations, and he said that he was going to Marrakesh and down in Morocco, one of his favorite places, for vacation. And I asked him how he was going. He says, oh, I'm going to go by boat, by ship. And I said, well, you know, even though I've been in the Navy, I said, I don't like ships too well because I get seasick. He fixed me with a rather stern, fatherly look. He said, young man, I was 41 at the time, as you get older, you will outgrow it. And he's right. I don't get seasick, airsick, anything else at the present time. I think it's all in the head.
We have a photograph that I think you well recognize.
Oh, I do. As a matter of fact, that's my favorite photograph of Pat. As you can see, she was then, and she is now, a very beautiful woman. When I got out there to the South Pacific, you know, they didn't let you take much with you, and I had to take a few things in my uniform, other things in my bag, and I found that I didn't have a photograph of hers, and several of the other fellows had photographs of their wives or girlfriends, and if the wife and the girlfriend was the same person, they had one photograph. But in any event, so I wrote her and I said, have a photograph taken. And that was taken in San Francisco. It's the best photograph ever made of her, in my opinion, and she sent it to me. At that time, incidentally, she was helping to build up the nest egg, which, along with my poker winnings and what I saved during the service, made it possible for me to run for Congress. She was working as an assistant to one of the executives of OPA in San Francisco as an economist.
Were you lonely in the Pacific?
Not really. I got along well with the other people. We'd talk to them. We'd talk at night, for example, and I read a lot. Whatever we could find, I read. I didn't have any occasions when I was just homesick. Sure, you miss the family and so forth and so on, but I was not lonely.
You've described...
and particularly not lonely as I had more to do. When I was first in Noumea for 2 or 3 months and so forth, it was a little harder then. In fact, the most difficult thing in wartime is to be in a rear area. The boredom is unbelievable. And that's why one of the reasons, not because you're brave, nobody's really, if he says he wants to be up where the action is so he can get shot at, he's either stupid or lying. But you want to be where the action is because you're bored where it isn't. And once you got up the line, I was the officer in charge of these various detachments. I had so much to do that I didn't have a little time to get bored.
In your memoirs, you describe a really searing experience of a bomber that came in from Rabaul.
Yes. As I pointed out, while I was in battle areas on Bougainville, for example, Vela, occasionally they dropped 1 or 2 there. Green Island, however, was expected to be a major battle area, but the Japanese, except for a few snipers, had been driven off or had evacuated before we got there. But Rabaul, 90 miles away, was still Japanese occupied, and it was heavily bombed by the Pacific Air Force there, by B-29s. The airstrip had not yet been finished. See, I came into Green by a PBY flying boat before the airstrip was finished, and proceeded to set up our SCAT operation, which was the operation for the DC-3s, which would come in as soon as the airstrip was finished. So that's how I got to know the Seabees so well. And there was a big bulldozer on the airstrip at the end at the time that this incident occurred. A B-29 had its undercarriage shot off. It, just before dusk, came in for a landing on this airstrip. It couldn't get back to wherever they had taken off from in order to bomb Rabaul. And I remember they made a belly landing, and it skidded along, and we all clapped when they made the landing. And then the plane swerved and ran head-on into the bulldozer. Went up in flames. I remember we rushed over. I had a marvelous corpsman, an Indian boy, who went right in through the flames and pulled out a couple, and I think a couple were saved. I got one out, and I can remember his face to this day. He was so young. And then I looked at his hand, and there was a wedding ring on it, just a single band. And I thought that then I was glad I wasn't the commanding officer that had to write his wife.
You came back in 1944, I think in August of 44.
That's correct.
Did you go direct to Los Angeles, or?
No, San Diego. San Diego was where we went in order to take the shots and everything you're supposed to do to, I guess, to be debugged or whatever they did do then. And Pat came down. She flew down from San Francisco. And I vividly remember the time that she came off a plane. It was a DC-3, I think United Airlines, and she was wearing a red dress, which is my favorite color, incidentally, for her. And I was standing over behind the fence, and I remember she ran toward the fence, and frankly, I got through the gate some way and ran to her, and that was one of the few times when we weren't concerned about showing a little public affection. We usually never did before or after.
From there, I think you went to Alameda.
We were at Fleet Air Wing 8,
assignments.
where my job was, I was called the first lieutenant, so to speak, which meant that really I was the head janitor. By that, I mean that I was in charge of keeping the place clean, you know, having the men that kept the place clean and shaped up and so forth and so on. And we had a very strict commanding officer. He was a fine man, but he was strict. And on inspections, he just gave us the devil. Fortunately, I had a chief who was a real outspoken, tough guy. He'd been in the Navy for 20 years, and the only reason he was at Fleet Air Wing 8 is that he was stationed in a carrier in the South Pacific, and the carrier was hit by a kamikaze, and he was blown into the air and landed on his feet and had flat feet. And so they sent him back, and here he was, and he didn't like it being there, but he did his job. Well, one of the things that the commanding officer had a fetish about was clean toilet bowls. And the toilet bowls usually were yellow. The water was that bad, but there are perhaps other reasons toilet bowls become yellow, I must admit. And 3 times we got a minus mark because everything else was clean, but our toilet bowls, the commanding officer said, they just aren't clean enough. So I said, Chief, we got to do something about that. He said, Lieutenant, I'll take care of it. The next month, the commanding officer came through. The bowls were glistening white. I said, Chief, what'd you do? He said, well, the pipes down below are going to be eaten out, but those bowls are clean. I just loaded them full of lye.
When from there you went east and did Navy contract termination work, terminating war contracts after the end of the war, and that was the point at which you became interested in politics, or had the first opening to get into politics.
Well, it was the first opening, true, and also it was an opportunity that came to us. I wasn't thinking consciously that after we were see, when we came east to be in contract terminations, we were first stationed in Washington briefly, then in Philadelphia for a couple of months, and then in New York for 4 months, and then back at Middle River, Maryland, where we were settling contracts for the Bud, not for the Bud in that case. Bud was in Philadelphia, but for the Martin Mars, the flying boat, which of course had been terminated. And it was when we were in Middle River, Maryland, that I received a letter from Herman Perry, who had gone to college with my mother and who was the head of the Bank of America and had known me when I was had been a young lawyer in Whittier, and who was one of those who had suggested that before I decided to come east, that I might be the favored candidate for the California State Assembly. In fact, it was really offered to me, and I made the decision to come east rather than going up to Sacramento, because it was an easy seat. We would have kept it when Gerald Keppel, who was the assemblyman, was appointed a judge. But anyway, I got this letter from Herman Perry, and that changed my life.
I think we have come to the end of our morning session.
Did we run out?